June 1944, northern France. The air still trembled with the echo of gunfire. Villages that once smelled of bread and laughter now reeked of smoke, fear, and hunger. In a shattered town square, the war had ended only hours ago. German banners had been torn down, and silence replaced the thunder of artillery. But amid the rubble, another battle began. A quiet one, fought not with bullets, but with empty stomachs. Children wandered through streets lined with broken glass, searching for anything edible. A potato, a crust of bread, even weeds from the gutters. Mothers hid their tears, pretending strength while famine hollowed their faces. Years of occupation had taken everything: food, livestock, hope. Then the trucks arrived. Green, loud, heavy with dust. The insignia of the U.S. Army on their sides. To the French civilians, they looked like ghosts of deliverance. American soldiers, young and weary, climbed down with cautious smiles. They had seen horror, too. Omaha, Utah, St. Louis, names that would never leave their minds. One of them, Private James Miller from Ohio, reached into his pocket, pulled out something wrapped in foil, and knelt beside a boy no older than 10. The child's eyes widened as the soldier broke the bar in half. Chocolate, a taste that had vanished from France since the first days of the war. In that moment, the war, with all its maps, orders, and graves, felt small. The boy didn't know about the Normandy landings or the German retreat. All he knew was sweetness melting on his tongue, a kindness he would remember for life. For many French families, that first piece of American chocolate was the first taste of freedom, and the beginning of a fragile peace. But how did this moment come to be? What had brought these exhausted soldiers into the starving heart of France? And how did a single act of compassion ripple through a broken nation still haunted by war? Before the chocolate, before the liberation, there was silence, the kind that presses against the soul. France, 1940 to 1944, was a country under occupation. The German army had marched through its borders with precision and fire, crushing resistance and dividing the nation in two. One ruled directly by Berlin, the other a puppet under Vichy command. In the north, including Normandy, life was suffocation. German soldiers patrolled the streets, ration books ruled the dinner table, and fear became the language of survival. The average French family was allowed barely enough bread, meat, or milk to survive. Coffee was a memory, sugar a dream, chocolate a myth from a past life. Children grew up thin and quiet. Mothers traded heirlooms for potatoes. Fathers whispered forbidden news from London, risking everything for a shred of truth. By 1944, starvation had become an invisible enemy more ruthless than any gun. But across the English Channel, preparations were underway to end it. For months, American and British soldiers trained in secret for the largest amphibious invasion in history, Operation Overlord. To them, France wasn't just a battlefield. It was a promise to free Europe from Nazi rule and restore humanity to places where it had been extinguished. On June 6, 1944, that promise roared to life. Dawn broke over Normandy, and the beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, turned into hell. The sand ran red as waves of American soldiers fought their way inland under relentless fire. By nightfall, the foothold was secured. But victory came at a terrible cost. In the days that followed, as the Allied forces pushed deeper into France, liberation began, not as parades or celebrations, but as a slow, painful awakening. Towns like Carentan, Saint-Lô, and Isigny-sur-Mer lay in ruins. Civilians crawled out from cellars to find their homes gone, their livestock slaughtered, their fields scorched. And then came the Americans, hundreds of thousands of them, young and foreign, with accents that sounded strange to French ears. Yet they brought something unseen in years: abundance. Their supply trucks carried not only weapons and fuel, but crates of canned meat, biscuits, cigarettes, and Hershey's chocolate bars, a small luxury included in every soldier's ration kit. To the soldiers, it was routine sustenance. To the French, it was treasure. For the first time in years, the balance of power had shifted. German uniforms disappeared. The stars and stripes fluttered on trucks rumbling through liberated towns. But along with relief came unease. The scars of war were deep. Hunger, grief, and mistrust still ruled the streets. In one small village west of St. Lo, survivors gathered near a destroyed church. The Americans had set up a temporary camp nearby. Rumors spread that the soldiers were sharing food with locals, not as charity, but as neighbors. Some approached hesitantly. Others, too proud or afraid, watched from a distance. Private James Miller and his unit were among them, part of the 29th Infantry Division, exhausted after weeks of combat. They had buried friends, slept in mud, and faced death at every corner. Yet when Miller saw a barefoot boy staring at their truck, holding an empty tin can, he didn't see an enemy or a stranger. He saw hunger, the same kind his own mother had endured during the Great Depression. He broke a chocolate bar and handed it over. It was a simple act, but word spread quickly. And within hours, dozens of children lined up shyly, eyes bright with hope. Soldiers opened their packs, offering biscuits, gum, and candy. The laughter that followed sounded foreign at first, almost uncomfortable. But then it grew. That moment, repeated across liberated towns, became a quiet symbol of humanity amid destruction. For many French civilians, these young Americans, barely older than their own sons, were the first living proof that compassion could survive war. What started as a single act of sharing soon became a ritual. Soldiers giving from their rations, civilians offering thanks in broken English, sometimes in tears. The war still raged, but something greater had begun. The slow restoration of trust, one piece of chocolate at a time. But the story didn't end there. The same kindness that united them soon faced a different kind of challenge. Suspicion, danger, and the harsh reality that not every liberated town saw its liberators as heroes. The deeper the Allied armies pushed into France, the more complicated liberation became. To the outside world, the battle lines were simple: freedom versus tyranny. But inside the towns and villages, things were messier. Hunger didn't care about politics, and desperation blurred the lines between gratitude and survival. As American convoys rolled through the countryside, civilians rushed to the roadsides. Some cheered, some wept. Others simply stared, hollow-eyed, cautious. Rumors had begun to spread. German snipers were still hiding in church towers. Collaborators were being exposed, dragged into the streets, sometimes killed by their neighbors. The line between joy and vengeance was razor thin, and in that chaos, the smallest acts of kindness carried the greatest weight. To the soldiers it was instinct, to help, to feed, to comfort. But command worried. The Army's rations were limited. Frontline units needed every ounce of supply. Officers warned against sharing food with civilians. "You can't feed all of France," one lieutenant had said. But soldiers did it anyway, quietly, secretly, without orders. Private James Miller's squad was stationed near St. Lo, a city reduced to ash by Allied bombing. Streets once lined with apple trees were now graveyards of twisted metal. Every night, families crept toward the American campfires, hoping for food. Miller and his friends, boys from Ohio, Texas, and New Jersey, began setting aside part of their K-rations, powdered milk, crackers, and, of course, chocolate. They joked about it, calling it Operation Sweet Tooth. But in truth, it was an act of rebellion, a small defiance against the inhumanity of war. One evening, as dusk turned the ruins golden, a young French woman named Claire approached the camp. Her dress was torn, her shoes barely held together, and in her arms she carried a bundle, her baby daughter Marie. Miller remembered his sister back home. Without hesitation, he offered her his remaining meal: a can of Spam, half a biscuit, and a chocolate bar he had been saving for weeks. Claire didn't speak English, and Miller didn't speak French. But gratitude needs no translation. She smiled, a small, trembling smile, and placed her hand over her heart. That night, as artillery echoed in the distance, she sat by the fire feeding her child tiny pieces of chocolate, one at a time. For the first time in years, The baby stopped crying. Word spread through the ranks. Soldiers from nearby divisions began doing the same. What began as one man's gesture turned into a quiet movement. Trucks would sometimes lose a crate or two of candy or biscuits, which somehow ended up in local villages. Not everyone approved. Some officers called it undisciplined. Others feared civilians would become dependent or that soldiers might get distracted. A few worried that such generosity could endanger operations, civilians crowding supply routes or attracting enemy attention. And indeed, danger found them. In August 1944, as the Allied advance reached the outskirts of Mortain, German forces launched a desperate counterattack. Pockets of Wehrmacht soldiers, trapped and starving themselves, slipped through forests and attacked from behind. One afternoon, while delivering rations to a local orphanage, Miller's truck was ambushed. Bullets tore through the air. The chocolate bars meant for children exploded in the dirt. Miller and his driver fought back, returning fire until reinforcements arrived. By the time the smoke cleared, 2 soldiers were dead. Miller survived, barely. He never forgot how absurd it felt, dying over candy. But back in the orphanage, where terrified children had watched from behind shattered windows, the story became legend. They whispered that the Americans had died protecting chocolate, not because of greed, but because it represented something greater: hope. In the weeks that followed, those same children began collecting foil wrappers from the ground, smoothing them out like treasures. To them, they weren't wrappers. They were relics, proof that kindness could exist amid war. Meanwhile, liberation swept across France. Paris was freed in August. Crowds cheered, kissed soldiers, waved flags, but behind the joy lay deep wounds. Thousands of civilians had died, towns lay in ruin, and shortages continued. Food was still scarce. The American soldiers, many barely 20 years old, kept giving what little they had. For some, it was a way to escape the nightmares of combat. For others, it was redemption, a reminder that they were fighting not just to win, but to heal. In September 1944, as Miller's division moved east toward the German border, he passed through one last village. The townspeople had painted "Merci les Américains" on a wall. "Thank you, Americans." A group of children ran beside their truck, waving. Miller reached into his pocket and found one final chocolate bar, warm from his hand. He broke it into 4 pieces and threw them out the window. The children caught them mid-air, laughing as the convoy disappeared down the road. War would go on for months more. There would be blood, snow, and silence before victory finally came. But for the civilians of France, those small moments, a soldier's smile, a shared meal, a taste of chocolate, would outlast the roar of cannons. Still, beneath those moments of tenderness, another story waited. One that tested how fragile peace could be, even among friends. Autumn came to Normandy like a slow exhale, fields of ruin giving way to quiet mist. But liberation did not mean peace. As the front lines moved east, the shadow of war lingered. Villages lay empty. Farmers returned to find their land cratered and salted, and hunger still ruled. In many liberated towns, civilians relied entirely on the rations shared by the Allied troops. It was a strange reversal: the conquerors feeding the conquered, the soldiers giving what governments could not. And though most welcomed the Americans with open arms, not everyone approved. By October 1944, whispers began spreading across northern France. The Americans give too much. They corrupt our children with candy. They flaunt their wealth. French officials worried that civilians were growing too attached, that pride was slipping away beneath gratitude. Some even accused the soldiers of bribing loyalty with chocolate and chewing gum. But to the men who had fought their way across Normandy, those accusations felt hollow. They had seen starvation, not strategy. They knew the difference between a gesture and manipulation. Private James Miller, still haunted by Mortain, continued visiting the same orphanage near St. Lo whenever his unit passed through. He would bring whatever he could: tins of soup, scraps of fabric, sometimes coffee for the nuns. The children adored him. To them, he wasn't a soldier. He was Monsieur Chocolat. One evening, as rain battered the shattered roof, Miller arrived to find the orphanage nearly empty. The older children had been sent to a nearby farm for shelter, leaving only a handful of orphans and Sister Hélène, the head nun. But something was wrong. The sister looked pale, anxious. She explained that a small group of German deserters had been spotted nearby, desperate and armed. They had already raided 2 farms. Miller radioed for backup, but communication lines were weak. The nearest patrol was hours away. He decided to stay. That night, gunfire echoed from the woods. The deserters had come. Miller ordered the children into the cellar and took position by the doorway, rifle ready. Sister Hélène prayed softly, clutching a small tin box filled with the last of the chocolate the soldiers had given them, a comfort she saved for the children when fear grew too heavy. The first shot shattered the window. Miller returned fire. The fight was brief, brutal, and close. By dawn, the attackers were gone, scattered or dead. Miller was hit once in the shoulder, but alive. When the backup unit finally arrived, they found the children safe. The tin of chocolate sat on the table beside the wounded soldier. The sister later said she believed it was the chocolate that kept the children silent through the night. Small pieces melting on their tongues while gunfire thundered above. That moment, unseen by cameras, unrecorded in official history, captured the essence of war's contradictions. Amid destruction, a single act of compassion could stand taller than any monument. Weeks later, as the 29th Infantry prepared to leave France for the next campaign, the townspeople gathered to say goodbye. Miller, arm in a sling, stood quietly at the back of the convoy. Claire was there, holding baby Marie, who now toddled in her arms. She offered him a small wrapped bundle. Inside was a bar of chocolate, rare, precious, and impossibly symbolic. It was French-made, from before the war. She had saved it for years, hidden in a drawer, untouched. She pressed it into his hands and said, haltingly in English, "For you, to remember France." Miller didn't speak. He simply nodded, eyes glistening. For a long moment there were no ranks, no uniforms, no borders, only 2 people who had shared hunger, fear, and humanity. The convoy left at sunrise. The roads were muddy, the skies gray. But as the trucks rumbled east, toward Germany and the final battles to come, each soldier carried more than ammunition and gear. They carried the memory of faces that had looked at them not as warriors, but as saviors. Not for conquest, but for compassion. In the months that followed, the story of Monsieur Chocolat spread across the region. Children drew pictures of American soldiers handing out candy. Local papers mentioned it in passing, calling it a symbol of the new friendship. But to those who lived it, it was more than friendship. It was faith restored. Miller never saw Claire or the children again. He survived the war, returned to Ohio, and rarely spoke about what he'd seen. Yet every Christmas, his family noticed the same thing. On the dining table, beside the candles, he would place a single chocolate bar, unwrapped but untouched. It wasn't for eating. It was remembrance. The chocolate had melted away years ago in the hands of hungry French children, but the meaning never did. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a continent reborn and broken. Cities smoldered. Families searched for the missing. Millions were displaced, homeless, or hungry. Yet amid that ruin, a strange kind of hope took root. Fragile, small, and sweet. In France, liberation became more than a military victory. It was a human one. The kindness of the American soldiers, their food, their warmth, their chocolate, lingered long after the convoys moved on. For many civilians, those small gestures had been the first signs that the world still contained goodness, that civilization could rebuild itself not through power, but through empathy. In the post-war years, the story of the chocolate soldiers spread quietly, carried in memories, letters, and childhood tales. French children who had once begged at camp fences grew up to tell their grandchildren about the taste of that first American chocolate. Some even sent letters decades later to the U.S. Embassy, asking if anyone remembered them. The children from Saint-Lô, Carentan, or Bayeux. Private James Miller lived a quiet life back in Ohio. He married, became a carpenter, raised 2 children. His war medals stayed in a drawer. But the chocolate wrapper from Normandy, the one given to him by Claire, he kept framed above his desk. When his daughter once asked why, he simply said, "Because that's what peace tastes like." Years later, when Miller passed away, his family found a note tucked behind the frame. It read, "In war, I learned that victory isn't when your enemy surrenders. It's when hunger ends, even for a moment." That single sentence became the perfect summary of what history books often overlook, that the Second World War was not only about generals and battles, but about countless quiet mercies that never made the headlines.